It looks like we're all here. So let me make a start. And I just want to say, first of all, good evening or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world that you're from. And a very warm welcome to the Center of Pan-African Thought, the space where we are developing the new generation of African intellects and thinkers out of the diaspora. We're really proud of the work that we do and the space that we have. And it's a space that's explicitly for Pan-African education and learning, an intellectual discussion on African philosophy, development, and political affairs. Now, for those who don't know, my name is Nigel. I'm the founder and director of the center, and I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's event. And the first thing that we do at our events, always, and it's customary, is to acquaint with each other by posting our name and location in the chat. So let me go first. And if you could just let me know where you're logging in from. So I'm broadcasting from Portugal. And we do that because we believe that learning also comes from you, our guests. You know, in the African village, everyone with experience has something to teach, not just me or our speaker for the evening. So we want to get to know who you are and get comfortable conversing with each other as the session proceeds. It also gives our speaker a temperature check for a steer on where the group is knowledge-wise, and that usually determines how deep the discussion goes. So let me just see. Welcome, Stella Brixton, Trinidad and Tobago. Big up Trinidad and Tobago, Trini family in the house. Tottenham, a place I know very well. Welcome, Helen. Welcome, Bedfordshire, a place I grew up in, actually. I grew up in a place called Luton, so welcome, Victoria. Welcome, Darren, London. Charlene, one of my friends, welcome, Woodford. Essex, Atlanta, Sharifa, back again, good to have you. Nina, Chucks, wonderful. Spain in the house, okay. No, Victoria, that can't be. Can't be that you're also in Luton as well. Very, very small world indeed. In fact, and one thing that you could also do is that if you were at the session last week, or should I say a couple of weeks ago, please let us know what your key takeaways or lessons were from Professor's lecture. So for me, it was the discussion and point on languages. And one, just how important it is to be mindful of being multi and bilingual in the African context. And two, for me, how important it is for unity that African countries unify their language and cultural policies along with their political and economic policies. In fact, I would probably go as far as to say unity without a common language or languages is near impossible. And I've personally made a commitment to learning an African language in my lifetime so I can teach my children. But what was the key takeaway for you? Let's get the conversation started early and let's continue in the same vein as the event unfolds. So today we're here to talk about education. And last session, I opened with a video of Bim Afolami, an Eton and Oxford educated Nigerian MP in the constituency of Hitchin and Harpenden, I believe, not far from where I live. Bim obviously has a brilliant political brain and he's talented and he's Black. However, in the video, he said two disturbing things for me, which were first and foremost, he identifies as British before his African and Nigerian heritage. And second of all, that Britain is his country and the country he loves and the country he fights for. He openly counts Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher as his heroes, no less. So here we are, an African, which by the way, by all accounts, ticks a diversity box somewhere if we're talking about the equality discourse we have in the UK. But here we are, an African Nigerian openly declaring his love for a colonial nation and its welfare above all others. So my question is this, in the Pan-African context, simply, is that right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Africans can't be British. After all, we, or should I say me, has been educated here or there. Of course, we're going to have British or French or German sensibilities if we're part of that culture. The question is, where do we place our allegiances when that is the case? The question is, when you have lived, earned, worked, and paid taxes in a colonial country, do you switch those allegiances, or how do you switch those allegiances towards the Pan-African dream? Now, I was recently reading a paper on the 1967 Arusha Declaration that outlined Julius Nyerere's philosophy on education. If you read the declaration in full, you realize how intricately linked education is tied to national and economic development. He knew that he could not fulfill his dream of building a socialist state, one built on ujamaa, on agriculture, on entrepreneurship and self-reliance, without education. He knew the key to that was education. And without the right education system, you could not have development, period. And so it is with Pan-Africanism. The two go hand in glove, in my view. So here are our questions for this evening. And I'm glad I'm not the one answering them, by the way, just so you know. Is what is and does a Pan-African education look like? What is the real and true impact of colonial education? And how do we see that playing out in terms of our pedagogies and knowledge production systems in the global North and the global South? So ladies and gentlemen, I have the man to answer these questions for us tonight, none other than our guest speaker and lecturer, distinguished professor and author, Dr. John Marah. And Dr. Marah is a professor and former chairperson of the African and African American Studies Department at SUNY College, Brookport, New York. He wrote his dissertation on Pan-African education at Syracuse University. He is the author of several key texts, including Pan-African Education, The Last Stage of Educational Development in Africa, a title called African People in the Global Village, and most importantly for us, the text that I've just read, Pan-African Education, a Must for African Union. He is also widely published in numerous academic journals like the Journal of Black Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and the Journal of World History, and many more. Like I said last time, I think it's fair to say we have with us a scholar of notable repute and stellar credentials, and one who is going to answer my barrage of questions, I'm sure, with comprehensive intellectual clout. No, but seriously, Professor, I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. Just so the audience is aware, the lecture will last for 35 to 40 minutes. Then I'll move into conversation with him before taking your comments and questions until the end. As always, all we ask is that you stay on mute until we call you to speak and share. That's to prevent, as I said earlier, again, background noise and protect your privacy. But do feel free to leave your cameras on so the professor can see and experience your reactions as he speaks. It's obviously a lot more real and encouraging for a speaker when he can see the audience that he's talking to. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome as I hand over to Prof. John K. Marah, who's there somewhere on my screen. And the floor is yours, sir. But you might have to come off mute first.
You can hear me?
We can now indeed, yes.
All right.
Take it away.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. As originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa, then of course from there to Massachusetts in the United States, from there to Alabama, and back to New York State, to Syracuse University. And when I finished there, I started teaching at this college here, which is not too far away from Syracuse University. In addition to that, I've also been privileged to take students from here to the University of Ghana, in Accra, Legon, for many, many years, for about 17 years in a row. To go there to study and to travel within the country and to go to the Ivory Coast, Togo, just to show the students some comparison between former French colony and the British colony and so forth. So that has been very helpful to me in terms of seeing other African cultures, other African people, not just Sierra Leone. So the last time we spoke, I spoke mostly about three major Pan-Africanists, Toussaint Louverture of Haiti, Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. That was my case study of those three people in terms of their contribution to the idea, the ideology of Pan-Africanism, and even practical Pan-Africanism. I concentrated on those three people because that was my task. That's what I had planned to do. But there are other Pan-Africanists as well. People like Edward Blyden, Nigeria and Sierra Leone, and Julius Nyerere. I just read one of his speeches or one of his pamphlets where he talked about education for self-reliance, and he was talking about Africa should change. He said the choice is not between change or no change. The choice for Africa is to change or be changed. Change for ourselves or be changed under conditions beyond our control. I said that is a profound statement. So my object is that African people should change with great force under their own control. So my object today is to talk about Pan-African education. What is Pan-African education? What is the history of Pan-African education? Before I get into that, I have to say that the education of African people has to be taken seriously. We cannot rely on our former enslavers and colonizers to continue educating African people. How do you expect your colonizer to educate you? How do you expect your enslaver to educate you? So I'm saying my argument is that the education of African people in the continent, as well as in the diaspora, have to be taken seriously by everybody, by parents, teachers, priests, pastors, journalists, all those people involved in what we call cultural agents. Journalists are cultural agents, novelists are cultural agents. We all have to take the education of African people seriously. So to talk about Pan-African education, I have to start with what we call traditional African education. That's number one, A, traditional African education. Before there were Arabs in Africa, before there were colonialists in Africa, before there were neo-colonialists in Africa, African people have always taken the education of their people very, very seriously. They call it traditional African education. Some will want to call it tribal education, but that's a whole different concept. So we don't ascribe to the idea of tribal, say traditional African education. Before Europeans, before the Arabs, Africans educated their people. They educated them to be good citizens, to be productive citizens, to be military people, to defend their units, their communities, and so forth and so on. We can go around the continent. In Guinea, for example, French Guinea, West Africa. Kamara Lai, in his book, The Dark Child, talks about traditional African education. How young Mandingo, Malinkis, were prepared to be men, to be husbands, to be wives. They are educated to be Mandingos. They spoke their language. They had their own religion. They had their own rites of passage from childhood to adulthood. And they were taught to behave themselves, to work for the community, for the progress of the community. You can go to East Africa, Kenya, Mr. Jomo Kenyatta's book, Facing Mount Kenya. Here also he talks about how Kikuyus were made into Kikuyu, the ethnic group, the rites of passage that they have to go through in order to be grown men, in order to be adults, in order to be leaders in their own community. You can go to Swaziland, you can go among the Zulus, you can go to Sierra Leone, among the Mende, for example. We have Poro and Bondo societies. These were societies that socialized the youngsters to become adults, so that throughout Africa, they had their own systems of education. Westerners will call it bush education, Westerners will call it informal education, but the fact of the matter is that these Africans were socialized, educated, prepared to be productive citizens of their communities, of their ethnic groups, and the kinds of livelihood they had to engage in, if they are going to be farmers, if they are going to be cattle rearers, if they are going to be fishermen, they were well prepared. If they are going to fight to defend the ethnic group, that's what they're going to do. They had, Chino Achebe in his book, Things Fall Apart, here again, he talks about how the Igbos were socialized to men. So we can go on and on and on, but the fact of the matter is that African people educated their people to be fruitful citizens of the communities in which they found themselves. Now, by the 700s, Islam took over East Africa, North Africa. And at the present time, we can say that it has taken over almost 1/3 of the continent. Islam brought its own system of education, and it imposed its own system on African people. Prophet Muhammad himself, his first convert was an Ethiopian slave. And in a book, Race and Color in Islam by Bernard Lewis. It's a small book, but there he talks about how Islam treated African people, Black African people, how it educated Black African people to look down on themselves. In Race and Color in Islam, Bernard Lewis talks about Black Africans writing poetry that looks down upon themselves. They write poetry against themselves. They have been educated to despise African cultures and so forth and so on. And this went on from 700s up to the present time. East Africa, North Africa, down into West Africa. This is in Mauritania, for example. If you go to Mauritania, dark-skinned Africans are not taken seriously. We know the attitude of Arabs in the Sudan, so forth. So what we have then is that we have traditional African education, on top of which was imposed Islamic education. And Islamic education in Africa today has divided Africans between who is an animist and who is Islamic, who's an animist and who's an Islamic. And the relics of this system is evident in places like Nigeria today. So we have traditional African education that existed. But now we have on top of that, Islamic education. Another book, Ronald Siegel. He has a book, it's a classic book, I say. He calls it Islam's Black Slaves. Ronald Siegel, Islam's Black Slaves. He calls it the other diaspora. He calls it the other diaspora because this time he was referring, his concentration was on African people that were taken through the Sahara Desert, through the Red Sea, and then through the Indian Ocean. Where did these people go? They went to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so forth, and Oman. So you have African people there today that were derived from that other trade, Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean. That was his task. He had written another book about the African diaspora, but that was, he concentrated on the Atlantic slave trade. But this is an important book, Islam's Black Slaves. How did Islam treat Black African people? What were the attitudes? How were they viewed? What kind of stereotypes did they have on African people? So we have that. Now, those are two systems right there. But on top, in addition to those two systems, that is the traditional and the Islamic, we get to the missionary system of education. This missionary system, we can say, originated in Africa in the 1400s. So the Arabs began in the 700s. They are there up to this point in time. Then in addition to that, we have the missionary European Western system coming into Africa, say from the 1400s, starting with the Portuguese, for example. By 1441, they had gone around West Africa, establishing trading posts and so forth. That Christianity, that missionary education, was also another system that was imposed on the African people. Now, what was the object of this missionary education? This missionary education, Western missionary education, was, of course, to Christianize African pagans or heathens or animists, if you like, to impose Christianity on African people. You could not be a Christian if you retained certain traditional cultural practices. You had to change your name from an African to a European name. You have to forget about polygamy. You have to forget about your dances. You have to forget about your cultural activities, rites of passage, in order to be a Christian. Again, we have Chino Achebe's Things Fall Apart, where Christianity was imposed on the Igbos. And we have in East Africa, Mr. James Ngugi's books, Weep Not Child, for example, where Christianity was imposed on the Kikuyu people. You have to change your name. You have to question your philosophy of life. You have to question everything about you. Imposed. And a lot of Africans fell for it in Uganda, in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, in Kenya. So that's a thought system that asks African people to change themselves, to change their worldview, so to speak, to change their cultural practices. And these Christians were competing with each other in East Africa. You know, the Africans were amused. I thought they were all Christians, but they were now competing with each other for African converts. That still goes on. And it taught African people to disrespect their own cultures. You cannot be a Christian and be African. You have to be called John. You have to be called Patrick. You have to be called Francis. Kwame Nkrumah was Francis. He wanted to be a priest. He was to go into the priesthood. We have these examples of impositions. Now, as if that was not enough, another system that was imposed on African people is the colonial system. Colonial system came hand in hand with missionary education in Africa. They came hand in hand. They reinforced each other. They supported each other. Colonial systems in Africa was an imposed educational system. A British system. I went through a British system. I had to study Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Canterbury Tales. You had the French system in places like Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Guinea, and Portuguese system. When the Germans were there, their own system as well. Then Belgium in the Congo imposed colonial systems. Again, these colonial systems did not respect African cultures. People try to make distinctions between, well, the French were different, well, the British were different, well, the Belgians were different. For the Belgians, Africans were children. They had to evolve. Africans are perpetual children. They had to evolve. They have to be civilized. They have to be brought to a stage where they get matriculation certificate. That is to say, you are now civilized. Now you can do this, so forth. So we had that system. One that thinks of African people as children that have to be civilized. Even, what's his name, Patrice Lumumba was treated in that respect. He had to have a civilized card. You have to be educated to a certain level in order to be considered human, so to speak. Then, of course, he had the French system. They say the French system, it was more centralized system. The curriculum was centralized. French philosophy, French literature, French system, centralized. We have a book called Africans Learn to be French by Bryant Mumford. He has a book called Africans Learn to be French. That is fascinating to me. Why can't Africans learn to be African? Why can't Africans learn to be African? Later on, we'll talk about Pan-Africanists, but right now, we can talk about why can't Africans learn to be African? Why do they have to learn to be French? And in that book, Bryant Mumford, I think the book came out in 1970, 1975. Study French philosophy, French culture, French this. It was to make Frenchmen out of Africans, only by the color of their skin. So we have that. And of course, he had the British system that was based on British curriculum. Kwame Nkrumah says you study British, even British weather was part of your education in that system. In East Africa, we have what? Black Muzungu. In the United States, we have Black Anglo-Saxons. We have the miseducation of Black people and so forth. So my argument is that why the French, the Germans, the Chinese are educated to be Chinese, the Japanese are educated to be Chinese. Why is it Africans that have to be educated to be somebody other than themselves? So that, well, the Portuguese, for example, they say that their colonies were extensions of the Portuguese state, overseas territories. So in the colonial system, whether it is French or English or Belgian or Portuguese, it doesn't matter. They all disrespected African culture. They all looked down on African culture, on African animism, on African dances, on African cultural practices. The attempt was to make Europeans out of African people, whether it is French, whether it is Portuguese, whether it is Belgian, and so forth. They all look down on African people. Now, the question I have is that if somebody looks down on you, what kind of education is he or she going to give to you? If somebody thinks that you are a perpetual child, what kind of education is he or she going to give to you? So we have that system in their minds, in their culture, and this was perpetuated so that when Congo got its independence in 1960, they hardly had any college-educated African people because that was not the object of the Belgian system. So these are some of the ideas that I grapple with. How are you going to teach somebody? How are you going to educate people that you think are uneducatable, that you think are inferior, that you think are going to be your servants perpetually? These are some of the ideas I have. Now, so we have those various colonial systems imposed on Africa, and some of those systems still exist. The remnants of them still exist. The relics of them still exist. The attitude still exists. You have to go to Oxford. You have to go to London School of Economics. You have to know Shakespeare. You have to know Ben Jonson. You have to know this. You have to know that. You may not know anything about your culture, but you have satisfied the metropolitan standard, the metropolitan system. Now, as if this colonial system was not enough, there's another system that was imposed on African people, and I call that educational adaptation system. This educational adaptation system was a borrowing from the southern states of the United States. Educational adaptation. It originated in the southern states of the United States after 1865, for example, when slavery was abolished, so to speak, or emancipation proclamation was announced, for another example. Now, the question came up, how do you train these people? How do you educate these people that had been in bondage, say from 1600 to 1865? Now they are free. supposedly we know better. How do you educate them? That's where the idea of educational adaptation comes in. That was borrowed or institutionalized by Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington went to Hampton Institute in Virginia. And his mentor in Virginia was Mr. General Armstrong. Mr. General Armstrong was a Civil War soldier, he fought during the Civil War. So he was a military man. But in addition to that, his parents were missionaries in Hawaii. Missionaries in Hawaii. Well, of course, they were there to perpetuate Christianity and so forth and so on. So you have these two aspects of Mr. General Armstrong. Thirdly, General Armstrong had the philosophy of industrial education. Industrial education, very similar to the British system that says that there are some people who may lose their smartness. They cannot go to Oxford, Cambridge, and so forth. So by the time they lose their smartness, you would have to give them some trade. They have to know how to work with their hands. They could become carpenters, they will become masons, and so forth. So Mr. General Armstrong institutionalized this ideology, this educational philosophy in Hampton Institute. And Hampton Institute was constructed for the education of the newly freed Africans, plus Native Americans, of course, and some poor whites. Mr. B.T. Washington imbibed this ideology from Hampton Institute. And in 1881, he was given the opportunity to found what? Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, Alabama. That's where this worked. Now, this is where this was implemented. The students have to work with their hands. The students have to make bricks. The students have to masons. The students will study for a few hours and they will work with their hands. You have to give these people a trade. They have to be carpenters. They have to be masons. Now, educational adaptation. This was transported to Africa. He said, if this system had worked so well in the southern states of the United States, why don't we take it to Africa? Educational adaptation. Edward H. Barman is a graduate of Columbia University in New York City. He wrote a beautiful essay. I think it's Journal of Negro History. He has a beautiful essay called Tuskegee in Africa. Tuskegee in Africa. That is a Tuskegee Institute model transplanted to Africa. If these Black Americans have been taught to work with their hands, and it has been very effective, why don't we take it to Africa, to Liberia, for example, which is practically an American colony. Let's take it to Kenya, which is a settler colony. Let's take it to South Africa, which is also a settler colony. In South Africa, you could call it Bantu education. But the idea of educational adaptation is to train Black people for inferior positions, for subservient positions. They should always work under the European American or the European in Africa. Educational adaptation. Since Black people are going to be working for us, we should train them to be good workers for us. We should not train them to be agitators. We shouldn't train them to be Malcolm X's. No, we don't want that. We want them to be subservient workers. B.T. Washington, in one of his speeches in Atlanta, 1895, he said we can be as separate as the fingers in all things dealing with social integration. We can be as separate as the fingers. We don't want to integrate with European people, but we can work for them. We can be their cooks. We can be their farmers. We can be their carpenters. We can be their caretakers. But we are not fighting for integration. This was good for colonialists in Africa. If this system has worked so well in the southern states of the United States, why don't we take it to Africa? And it was taken to Africa, to Kenya. And we know that's a settler colonies. In Kenya, you carry kipande. It's like a pass card in South Africa. You are not supposed to mix with European people. European people have their own settlements, their own housing. The natives have their own house. The same thing in the Congo. The Belgians, colonizers, had their own neighborhood. The native Africans had their own neighborhood. So there's no integration here. The African could be educated, but he always works under the European colonizer and the European American in the United States. So we have that. So thus far we have what? Traditional system, Islamic system, missionary system, colonial system, and educational adaptation. We have that present on the African continent. Institutions built for the perpetuation of those types of education. Now, some Africans saw through this. I call that nationalist education. Africans saw through this. They say, why should we be educated inferiorly? People like Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, for example, he has an essay, How Should We Educate the African? Nnamdi Azikiwe, essay called How Should We Educate the African? He has a book also called Renaissance Africa. They saw through this. These African nationalists, early in the 1800s, started saying, we've got to have a more appropriate kind of education for African people. Colonial education is not doing it. Educational adaptation is educating African people for inferior positions. Missionary education is not doing it either. We don't want to be Christians. We want to be animists, or we want to be Islam. Why should we be subjected to Western Christianity? So that people like Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, and even William Biden in Liberia, William Biden, he has a book called Islam, Christianity, and the Negro Race. Islam, Christianity, and the Negro Race, where he is against Christian education and is against colonial education. So we have these African people, a few of them, mind you, few of them in the 1920s, late 1890s, challenging colonial education. Another fellow in Sierra Leone, what's his name? Africanus Houghton, in his book, West African countries. So we have a few Africans that saw through these colonial systems. Kwame Nkrumah also saw through this. Even when he was in college in the United States at Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania, he was writing essays on education. He got degrees in education, so forth, so on. He was writing against this. So we have that system, traditional, African nationalist education. Now, before I get into Pan-African education, there is another major system that was imposed on Africa. And that, I call it renewed American interest in African education, especially from 1945 to the 1980s. From 1945 to the 1980s, United States became highly interested in African education. Hello? That is the period of the Cold War also. So there's a war between intellectual war, cultural war between the United States and the Eastern Europe. Who is going to have control of the African mind? Is it the capitalist system or is it the Marxist system? From 1945 up to this point in time, we can argue the United States has been very, very interested in the education of African people. Now, Edward H. Barman also, I quote him again, has written a beautiful essay on United States interest in African education from 1945 up to the 1970s and so forth. The United States wanted to influence African academic orientations towards the capitalist system. They gave a lot of money to Nigeria. Ibadan University, for example, gave them money. This is what you need. This is what you need. Additionally, we had professors from Columbia University, teacher education programs coming from Columbia University. Edward H. Barman is writing all of this. Beautiful essay in Harvard Educational Review. Harvard Educational Review. He published this essay. How Ford Foundation, for example, Carnegie Foundation, for another example, Columbia University, were all interested in having an input in African teacher education, African university education, fighting about which paradigm to win. Is it going to be the Russian paradigm or is it going to be the Western paradigm? If you check the record, United States, of course, Peace Corps, US Peace Corps were all over Africa, in Ethiopia, in Sierra Leone, in Ghana. They're all over the place, transporting American academic orientations, American academic paradigms in these African universities. So that is another influence. Peace Corps, they were teaching in high schools. Peace Corps, they were teaching at the universities. In fact, they went to a stage in Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah said, no, these Peace Corps have to go. The only people that we need to come as Peace Corps are those that teach French and the sciences, not the social sciences, because the social sciences can be used to indoctrinate, right? In Ethiopia, for example, the Peace Corps taught the Ethiopian students to rebel against Emperor Haile Selassie and so forth. In other words, they undermined the status quo. So that's another thing. At the same time, some of these African nationalists were talking about Pan-African education. So we have the United States competing with Russia, but then we have an astute number of African leaders talking about Pan-African education. Now, Nigel started with, what's his name? Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. He was also interested in a different type of education. He said the education in Tanzania should be socialist-based, not colonialist-based. In addition to that, we have Emperor Haile Selassie in 1963. He has an essay published in Journal of Modern African Studies, where he talks about Pan-African education. In this respect, he said Africa should have a Pan-African university. It is in his essay, 1963. Africa should have a Pan-African university. You know why? So that we can train a cadre of experts to help in African development, but also this African university where we get to know each other better. He said the problem we have, we don't know each other. We don't know each other. But in this African university, we will get to know each other better as Africans. That is a beautiful essay that somebody can pick up. African University to train a cadre of African people. And thirdly, this African university should be like what? Geared towards African integration. So we get to know each other as brothers and sisters, not as Kenyans and Ugandans and Sierra Leoneans and Ghanaians, but as a people that have a vision, that have a goal. Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, he has several books. Zambia shall be free. Letter to my children, humanists in Africa. But he's talking about the same thing. We have to get to know each other, and we can use our educational institutions for that matter. He talks about seeing Africa as a whole, not as separate parts. Same thing with, what's his name? Sekou Touré of Guinea. It's a cultural aspect to come from Africa. The same thing with Patrice Lumumba, talking about authentic, African culture. So that when the United States was heavily interested in inundating the African mind, a few African leaders were talking about Pan-African education. Kwame Nkrumah, he talks about our Pan-African future, in his book, Conscientism. He's talking about our Pan-African future. Homeboy is ahead, a Pan-African future. And he's talking about conscientism, African conscientism. So we have that. Now, before I get into this idea of Pan-African education, we are cognizant, we are aware of, say, from 1989 up to the present. Now we're talking about globalization. Globalization has come to the picture. Globalization. Who is going to win? 1989, Russia has lost out. United States is the one on top right now in the global village. Professor Abrahams, I think he teaches in Connecticut. He has a book called Global Cities. Global Cities. You can Google it, Global Cities. Global Cities, in that book, he's talking about New York City being at the apex in the global culture. New York City, of course, below New York City, you have London, Paris, and so forth. But New York City seems to be the center, cultural center, economic center, cultural center in the 21st century. They tell people about cultures, about, we can say hegemony, Western hegemony. That is what is happening right now. So we've gone from Islam to colonialism to African independence, and now we're talking about Western hegemony. There's a Japanese writer, Kenichi Ome. He has several books. He talks about the end of the state as we know it. He's talking about region states. In other words, he's talking about in the 21st century, what is important is larger and larger economic units. ECOWAS, West Africa, for example, could be an economic unit. East Africa, for example, could be an economic unit. Pan-Africanists are arguing that the continental Africa should be an economic unit so that it can compete with other large economic units. Not 55 countries. Some countries are so small, they are not even up to 1 million. Some countries are 5 million or 6 million. That's a big city in the United States. So Kennedy, OHMAE is talking about the end of the nation states. Now we're talking about larger and larger economic units. Now, what should African people do in that kind of context, in that scenario? We have European Union, you have United States, Canada, and Mexico. You have India. You have these large economic units. How are African people going to compete in this 21st century? So my object then is that it is time for Africans to institutionalize what we mean by Pan-African education. That's what it is. We've gone through tribal education or traditional education. That is good. That was good when it was good. Well, now Kikuyus have to deal with Kambas in Kenya. In Guinea, the Mandingos have to deal with Fulas. The Fulas have to deal with Susu. They have to deal with other ethnic groups. That traditional education has to be transcended. Islamic education does not suffice either, because it pits African people against each other. Suppose I'm not a Muslim. I don't want to be a Muslim. I'm an animist. I like being an animist, or I like being a Marxist. How am I going to be accommodated in Islamic education? So we can go down the line and talk about the limitations of tribal traditional education, limitations of missionary education, limitations of colonial education, limitations of educational adaptation, and all the way down. It is time for African people to institutionalize what we mean by Pan-African education. By Pan-African education, I mean...
2 minutes to land on that point, if you may.
Is that right? Okay. By Pan-African education, I mean the education of African people for continental African citizenship. The education of African people for continental African citizenship. This system transcends traditional systems, Islamic systems, colonial systems, narrowly nationalistic systems. Pan-African education is talking about the integration of African educational institutions. For example, University of Kampala should recruit students from all over Africa and even from diaspora. University of Ghana at Legon should recruit faculty members from all over Africa and from diaspora. And curriculum will have to be geared towards the ultimate integration of African people. I don't know, I'm not a Ugandan, but I love to read Okot Pibitek. I'm not a Kenyan, but I love to read James Ngugi, South Africa, Peter Abrahams. You know, these are all knowledge areas that African people have to tap in. We have to be able to transcend our micro-nationalisms for what Kwame Nkrumah calls our Pan-African future. This calls for reconstruction of our curriculum and our student and faculty and staff. There's no other choice, I think. How else are we going to compete with larger and larger economic units that are dominating the global village as we have it? Thank you very much.